Welcome to part 2 of this presentation on Elizabeth de Vere. Please remember that a PDF of the presentation is to be found by following the link on the YouTube page. In this part we're going to explore the life of Elizabeth until her death in 1627. You'll meet members of the Stanley family into which she married, and we'll take a careful look at whether or not her husband William was the man behind the pen name William Shakespeare. Lastly, I'll give you the opportunity of looking at an interesting painting. We left part 1 with the return of Edward de Vere from Europe and the estrangement from his wife Anne, which lasted for 6 years, during which time Elizabeth lived with her mother and grandparents at Cecil House and Theobald's. I can find no record of her following the family's reconciliation, but it's reasonable to conclude that she lived with Edward and Anne and the 2 surviving daughters, which were to follow, before the untimely death of her mother from a fever at Greenwich Palace on June the 5th, 1588. By this stage, Elizabeth was just 12 years old. Lord Burleigh, on the lookout for a good marriage for Elizabeth, attempted to engage the young Earl of Southampton, Henry Rosalie, who was one of his wards. By 1590 he was negotiated with Henry's grandfather, Anthony Browne, 1st Viscount Montague, and his mother Mary. However, Henry did not like the arrangement, and in a letter written in November of 1594, about 6 weeks after Southampton had turned 21, the Jesuit Henry Garnet reported the rumour that the young Earl of Southampton, refusing the Lady Vere, payeth £5,000 of present payment. This was an outrageous sum. Lord Burleigh's hurt pride at the refusal was assuaged by his love of money, for which he was notorious. As Master of the Court of Wards, Lord Burleigh was in the position to see the highest possible damages were charged on his behalf. The law was on his side. If an heir will not marry at the request of his lord, he should not be compelled thereunto. But when he cometh of full age, he shall give to his lord, and pay as much as any would have given him for the marriage. The worst element was that the money was to be paid in one amount rather than in instalments, almost certainly driving him to the money-lenders. The easy option would, like Edward de Vere, to have capitulated, married Elizabeth, and then built his own life outside the marriage. There is another intriguing connection in that there's good evidence that Henry Rosalie was the son of the Queen and Edward de Vere. Henry would then have been marrying his half-sister, and in the process elevating the Cecils to royalty. Much has been made of the argument that in the first 17 sonnets, Edward de Vere wrote repeatedly imploring Henry to get married and have children, something he was unlikely to have done if the intended bride was Elizabeth de Vere. In fact, there was no suggestion from the sonnets of a specific wife. The pleading was more to convince Henry to forsake his wasteful life and get married and ensure the Tudor line. At the time, Henry was having too much fun gambling and womanizing to consider settling down, and one assumes he'd had quite enough of Lord Burleigh's overbearing presence in his life. Elizabeth de Vere went to court around 1591, where she served as one of Queen Elizabeth's maids of honour. Lord Burleigh gave her a gold angel worth 10 shillings to play at cards as a debut to her career. The gold coin, bearing an image of the Archangel Michael slaying a dragon, representing the devil, on the obverse side, and an image of an English galley on the reverse side. It was an iconic coin, after which many English pubs were named. It's not clear when Elizabeth met her husband-to-be, but it's been suggested that it was at the extremely lavish and indeed extended entertainment of the Queen at Elvertham, arranged by Edward Seymour, Lord Hertford, in September of 1591 as part of the Queen's progress. The event lasted for 4 days and by all accounts was a grand occasion. It was centred upon the great pond. The Queen is shown seated on a throne being serenaded by Nereus, the sea god, who appears to be towing a ship entitled The Pinnace of Neaera and Her Music, Pinnace being a small boat and Neaera being a Greek water nymph. The name of Elizabeth's husband-to-be was William Stanley, and before we go any further I need to tell you about the Stanley family, because they were very important. The Stanley family is the Earls of Derby, named after the ancient hundred of Derby near Liverpool, rather than the city of the same name. The famous horse race, the Derby, is named after the family who instigated it, and not the city of the same name. Thomas Stanley, 2nd Baron Stanley, married Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, and the title First Earl of Derby was conferred upon him in 1485 following the Battle of Bosworth Field. It was he who betrayed Richard III and presented his crown to Henry Tudor. In return, he was made a very rich man. The couple had no children, but the ancient peerage of the Earls of Derby had been recreated. Bear with me for some family history to see how the Earls of Derby came to have a claim on the English throne. This is Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VII and younger sister of Henry VIII. She briefly married Louis XII of France and later Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk. They had a daughter, Eleanor Brandon, who married Henry Clifford, 2nd Earl of Cumberland. And they had a daughter, Margaret Clifford, who duly married Henry Stanley, 4th Earl of Derby. And they had 2 sons, Ferdinando, the 5th Earl, who had a good Lancastrian name, and William, the 6th Earl. Well, why am I telling you this? Well, in the rather chaotic picture of Tudor succession, this provided a direct line from Henry VII to Ferdinando, and then his eldest daughter, Anne. In other words, Ferdinando was a possible successor to Elizabeth I. This may have a bearing on one element of our story, as you'll see shortly. The Stanleys had 2 main properties near Liverpool. This is Knowsley Old Hall, which dates from around the time of Henry VII. Indeed, he stayed here along with his queen. Although this part still remains, there is a massive later extension out of sight on the left, which is now used as a wedding venue. The house is open for just 1 week a year, and it's well worth a visit. Each room is themed on different stages of the hall's history. Alternatively, if you get an invite to a wedding, you can see it for free. The second property was Latham House or Castle. This engraving shows the building with its fortifications just prior to the Civil War. Charlotte de Tremoille, wife of the 7th Earl of Derby, famously resisted a siege of the house by parliamentary forces between February and May of 1644. She was relieved and fled to the Isle of Man. The house itself sustained serious damage, and although the Derby family regained possession after the restoration, it was later to be abandoned in favour of Knowsley Hall. Nothing of the original building exists. Our interest starts then with the 5th Earl of Derby, Ferdinando. He was born in 1559, and in around 1573 the title Lord Strange was added to his name. In 1579 he married Alice Spencer, a daughter of Sir John Spencer of Altrop in Northamptonshire. Ferdinando was a poet and supporter of the arts, enjoying music, dance, poetry and singing, but above all he loved the theatre. He was the patron of many writers including Robert Greene and Christopher Marlowe. Edmund Spenser, a distant relative of Alice, praised his poetical skill, and in his poem of 1595, Colin Clout's Come Home Again, incorporated Ferdinando under the name of Amintas and Alice as Amaryllis. Sadly, none of Ferdinando's poetry or writings survive. Lord Strange's men were initially a troupe of acrobats and tumblers, which was reorganised, emphasising the performance of plays. By 1590, Strange was allied with the Admiral's men, performing at the Theatre in Shoreditch, owned by James Burbage. In 1593, Ferdinando's father Henry died, and he succeeded him as the Earl of Derby. Lord Strange's men was then renamed Derby's men. Now Ferdinando had two problems. Firstly, his claim to the throne of England by way of his descent from Mary Tudor, and secondly, he was thought by many to have Catholic tendencies, both of which made him vulnerable. Soon afterwards, rumours began of plots to install Ferdinando as the Catholic King of England. A certain Richard Hesketh, a family friend, approached him to discuss the matter. This led to 2 meetings before Ferdinando rejected the proposal and handed Hesketh on to Lord Burleigh, and he was summarily executed. Unfortunately, this did not have the desired effect, and Ferdinando remained marginalised at court. His action also antagonised Catholic sympathisers. This is the original dining room at Knowsley Hall, its walls hung with family portraits, including a fine one of the 6th Earl, whom we shall meet shortly, and next to him one of Margaret Beaufort. Now the curator assures me that it was in this very room that Ferdinando began to feel ill after eating a meal less than a year after his succession. For 12 days he lingered, while 4 of the best doctors in the country, including the famous Dr. John Case of Oxford, laboured in vain to save him. 2 of his retainers wrote gruesomely detailed accounts of the progress of his diseases, accounts that survive in manuscript today. When he died, Dr. Case was heard to murmur, "Flat poisoning, and none other but." For months after his passing and interment, no one could get close enough to the family crypt to pay his or her respects because of an overwhelming stench that continued to emanate from his body. William Camden, the historian, wrote of his demise. Ferdinand Stanley, Earl of Derby, expired in the flower of his youth, not without suspicion of poison, being tormented with cruel pains by frequent vomitings of a dark colour like rusty iron. There was found in his chamber a small image of wax, the belly pierced through with hairs of the same colour that his were, put there as the wiser sort have judged to remove the suspicion of poison. The matter vomited up stained the silver basins in such sort that by no art they could possibly be brought again to their former brightness. No small suspicion lighted upon the gentleman of the horse, who, as soon as the Earl took to his bed, took his best horse and fled. Different sources suggested poisonous mushrooms, while a writer in the Lancet in 2001 speculates on an early English use of arsenic. It's been suggested that Robert Cecil and his father lay at the heart of the conspiracy, in that their agents had been found lurking at the edges of the plot, the governing elite having decided that it was time to get rid of any possible contender for the throne. Some suspicion fell on William Stanley, but this was not Ferdinando's brother. This man was the son of Sir Rowland Stanley, who was deeply involved in the anti-Elizabethan plots and was working alongside Hesketh. Shortly before Ferdinando's death, his players, the Earl of Derby's men, had performed at Latham House, and for a month afterwards they played there as the Countess of Derby's men. It was brother William who then inherited the title of the 6th Earl of Derby. He was born in 1561 and was educated at St. John's College, Oxford. In 1582 he travelled to France, and then for the next 6 years travelled widely in Europe, leading to exaggerated tales of his adventures. On the death of his brother, he became embroiled in a protracted and complex inheritance dispute, orchestrated by the dowager Countess of Derby. He inherited the titles of 6th Earl of Derby and Lord Strange from his brother in 1594, but Ferdinando's 3 daughters claimed the estates. The claim to the throne passed on to Ferdinando's eldest daughter, Anne. On May the 9th, 1594, just 3 weeks after Ferdinando's death, his widow, in a letter to Sir Robert Cecil, says that she hears of a motion of marriage between the Earl, my brother, and my Lady Vere, your niece. Dowager Countess was no friend of the new Earl, as their subsequent quarrels over the Derby estates showed, and in the letter quoted she adds spitefully, "I wish her a better husband." There seems no doubt that the early death of her husband was not part of her game plan, and she was about to make life even more difficult for the new Earl. In September of 1594, Lord Burleigh finally gave his permission for William to marry his granddaughter. The tone of a letter from William to Lord Burleigh reflects his impatience. "My very honourable good lord, I understand that my servants have thoroughly acquainted your lordship with my estate, and that now it pleaseth your lordship to partly refer the further speeding to my liking. How grateful the message was unto me, I leave your lordship to conjure. In which case I pray your lordship to consider my affection to that honourable lady, and the investing of me in this estate whereunto Almighty God hath called me, in which by so honourable a patron with my lady and mistress to both our contentments and your lordship's comfort, God the worker of all goodness may send a son. Nevertheless, I must and will be wholly directed by your lordship in this and all other respects, and so humbly take my leave. From my house at Cannon Row, this 13th of September, 1594, your lordship's assured friend to command, Will Derby. Put more simply, of course, can we get married now, please?" The deferment of the marriage was partly due to Alice Spencer being pregnant. Fortunately for William, she delivered a girl, so that his earldom was secure. William married Elizabeth de Vere on the 26th of January 1595 at Greenwich Palace, with great solemnity and triumph in the presence of the Queen. In the years that followed, there seemed to have been close contact between the Derbys and Elizabeth's father, Edward de Vere. Shortly after the wedding, Edward was staying with the couple at their house in Cannon Row, which was close to the Palace of Westminster. On the 7th of August 1594, he wrote to Lord Burleigh that, "On my coming to Byfleet from Cannon Row, the Earl of Derby was very earnest that he might assure £1,000 a year for my daughter, and marvelled that Sir Robert Cecil, her uncle, and I, her father, were so slack to call upon it, so I desire something may be done therein. In other words, let's claim the money." In September 1596, Edward was again staying with his son-in-law in Cannon Row. In the same year, Lady Oxford bought King's Place in Hackney. In January of 1599, Lady Oxford was being entertained by the Derbys at Thistleworth, from where William wrote that he intended to accompany the Countess back to her home. He wrote to Sir Robert Cecil from Hackney on the 28th of January, and in November of the same year the Derbys were once more staying at King's Palace. These were chance records of their movements, and yet they reveal close contact in 1595, 1596, and twice in 1599. In the early years, the relationship of William and Elizabeth was stormy, including claims that Elizabeth had affairs with Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, and Walter Raleigh. As early as May 1595, Elizabeth was rumoured to be having an affair with the Earl of Essex. The rumours flared up again in late 1596 and again in the summer of 1597. In August of that year, Lord Burleigh intervened. By one account, Elizabeth and her husband separated in 1598, but were reconciled in 1599. Joanna Rickman in Love, Lust and Licence in Early Modern England has Elizabeth leaving court for Lancashire in July of 1597 and remaining there for several years. According to her, Elizabeth arrived at Knowsley on July the 28th, and Derby receiving letters from the court on August the 8th telling him about the affair with Essex. He flew into a rage, but within a few days loyal servants had prevailed upon him to reconcile with his wife. On August the 20th, 1597, William Stanley signed a statement. "If anyone can say that I know my wife to be dishonest of her body, or that I can justly prove it by myself or anyone else, I challenge him the combat of life. If anyone suppose any speeches of mine to have proceeded out of that doubt, he do me wrong. The 20th of August at Greenwich, signed Will Derby, in the presence of W. Burleigh, Lord Howard, and Robert Cecil. Although the Derbys had Derby House in Cannon Row, Manolo Guerci, in his splendid book entitled London's Golden Mile, The Great Houses of the Strand, provides clear evidence that they were also leasing Russell House between 1596 and 1601, when Elizabeth was recorded as living there and was interested in buying it. Next door, of course, is Durham House, the London home of Sir Walter Raleigh. Although Russell House was relatively modest in the early 1590s, it became one of the finest houses on the Strand 50 years later, by that stage renamed as Worcester House. The summer of 1602 featured a soggy progress by Queen Elizabeth to various noble households in the vicinity of London, interspersed with elaborate royal entertainments. In the midst of the formal festivities occurred an enigmatic and apparently distressing incident involving the Queen, her principal secretary Robert Cecil, and his niece Elizabeth, Countess of Derby. William Browne writes thus to the Earl of Shrewsbury describing the event. I send your lordship here enclosed some verses compounded by Mr. Secretary, who got Hales, he was the Queen's lutenist, to frame a ditty unto it. The occasion was, as I hear, that the young lady of Derby, wearing about her neck, in her bosom, a picture, which was in a dainty tablet. The Queen, espying it, asked what fine jewel that was. The Lady Derby was curious to excuse the showing of it, but the Queen would have it, and opened it, and finding it to be Mr. Secretary's, snatched it away and tied it upon her shoe, and walked along with it there. Then took it thence and pinned it to her elbow, and wore it there for some time also, which Mr. Secretary, being told of, made these verses, and had Hales to sing them in his chamber. It was told Her Majesty that Mr. Secretary had rare music and song. She would needs hear them, and so this ditty was sung, which you see first written. More verses there be likewise, whereof some, or all, were likewise sung. I do boldly send these things to your lordship, which I would not do to anybody else, for I hear they are very secret. I've managed to trace a couple of the verses written hastily and sung by Robert Cecil in an attempt to get back into the Queen's favour. Please forgive me if I do not attempt to sing them for you. From a servant of Diana, as faithful as the best, his peerless mistress took it. It pleased her so to do. What magic that angelic Queen to wear the picture so? She at her elbow wear it, to signify that he, and at her foot she placed it, where he would prostrate lie, and at her foot she placed it, where he would prostrate lie. A lady got a picture, and wear it at her breast, and wear it at her elbow, though first tied at her shoe. Meant she to scorn her servant, and to disgrace him? No. To serve her at her elbow doth ever love to be, to show where he resolved, even at her foot to die. To show where he resolved, even at her foot to die. It elegantly demonstrates that no one in the Elizabethan court was above humiliation. The dispute over inheritance rumbled on for a total of 9 years. Ferdinando's eldest daughter, Anne, Countess of Castlehaven, officially became the heir presumptive to Elizabeth's throne in 1596, with the death of her grandmother, Margaret Clifford, who was the previous direct descendant of Henry VII's daughter, Mary. The Isle of Man, a possession of the 5th Earl, was forfeit to the Queen. However, the Queen ceded her right to it in recognition of the Stanley family's services and William was granted Latham and Knowsley, with other lands and estates in Lancashire, Cumberland, Yorkshire, Cheshire, Wales and elsewhere, while Ferdinando's daughters received estates linked to the baronies and the Isle of Man. But they sold the latter to their uncle, the 6th Earl, and his title to it was later confirmed by James I. While retaining the title Lord of Man, William passed the administration of the Isle of Man to his niece, Anne Stanley. The relationship settled down as Derby's financial and social position stabilised. The couple had 5 children, of whom 3 reached adulthood. James Stanley, 7th Earl of Derby, who was born in 1607 and died in 1651. Then there was Robert Stanley, who died in 1632, and Anne Stanley, Countess of Ancram. She married first Sir Henry Portman and secondly Robert Carr, the first Earl of Ancram. William limited his involvement with national politics, devoting himself primarily to the management of his estates and his dominant position in local administration in Lancashire and Cheshire. In 1603, he became a member of the Privy Council of England. In addition to the great houses at Latham and Knowsley Hall, the Stanleys maintained a house in Cannon Street, London. Queen Elizabeth granted Derby the Order of the Garter in 1601, while James appointed him Lord Chamberlain of Chester. In 1604, Elizabeth returned to court as a lady of the drawing chamber to Anne of Denmark. She left before the birth of her first son, James, 7th Earl of Derby, in 1607 and did not return. She was, however, the Queen's chief mourner in 1619. From 1609, Elizabeth gradually took over administrative duties relating to the political affairs of the Isle of Man. She attempted to influence business on behalf of the Isle, and a letter written on the 15th of September 1609 by Elizabeth to her uncle Robert Cecil regarding the shipment of money from the Isle of Man. The Countess of Derby to the Earl of Salisbury and the Earl of Suffolk, 1609, September the 15th. I have made choice of John Ireland, Esquire, your lordship's lieutenant and captain of the Isle of Man, for the receiving of all moneys henceforth due upon the foot of the accounts of officers there, and to cause the same to be transported to Liverpool for my use. The doing thereof may sometimes prove dangerous by means of piracy or wreck, and I hold it not convenient the loss should be charged upon him. I pray your lordships by your letters will be pleased to undertake the savings of him harmless from such casualty and danger, so as the same happen not through his own negligence. I hereby promise to discharge your lordships from all loss that may grow to you by such undertaking. From the Strand, on the 15th day of September 1609, signed your lordship's most loving niece and cousin, E. Derby. I think you'll agree the tone and content of the letter conveys a woman to be reckoned with. In 1612, Elizabeth was appointed as the first female Lord of Man, a title she held until her death in 1627. She was succeeded by her eldest son, James. For those not familiar with the geography and governance of the Isle of Man, it lies in the Irish Sea, midway between Northern Ireland and the English Lake District. The Isle of Man Parliament, or Tynwald, had been in existence for 1,000 years. Initially Norwegian, it came under English control in 1341, ruled by a series of feudal lords called Kings of Man. In 1461, the English crown granted it to Sir John Stanley, and thereafter the title of Lords of Man was adopted. In the early 17th century, the Parliament consisted of 24 members or keys, 4 from each of the 6 sheadings of the island as shown on the map: Glenfarber, Michael, Ayr, Garth, Middle and Rushton. The keys were unelected and imposed for life, with the role passing down to the next generation. The keys met irregularly at the request of the Lord of Man, or the deemsters who acted as judges. Such meetings took place wherever the Lord of Man wished. From 1610, the keys developed the power to create new laws. Each year, on July the 5th, the Parliament met at the village of St. John's, on the ancient mound called Tynwald Hill, the origins of which are lost in the mists of time. The mound consists of 4 truncated cones sitting on top of one another and each decreasing in size. On the top, at an elevation of 12 feet, sits the Lord of Man. The first recorded regular court was held in 1417 by Sir John Stanley. Since then, laws passed in the last 12 months were promulgated and petitions made. Adjacent to the mound has stood a succession of churches. As the Lord of Man, Elizabeth was responsible for the legislature of the island, and her tenure appears to have been a calm period. Not so with her son James, who took up the role after her and was known and disliked for his autocratic nature. She would have visited the island for the Tynwald Court, but it seems likely that her other duties were carried out either at Latham House or Knowsley Hall, both around 100 kilometres by sea from the Isle of Man. There is little record of Elizabeth in later life. She died on the 10th of March 1627 at Richmond Palace at the age of 51. She was buried in the Cecil family vault in Westminster Abbey. She is represented by the effigy of herself at around the age of 12. In life as in death, once a Cecil, always a Cecil. Alice Spencer seemed unwilling to relinquish her links to the Earldom of Derby, being referred to throughout her life as the Dowager Countess of Derby. She married Sir Thomas Egerton in 1600 and continued to move in the highest social circles. In this late engraving, you can see that she refers to her husband as the King of Man, a title he did not use. She was then, of course, the Queen of Man, and then there were her 3 daughters, Lady Anne, Countess of Castlehaven and heir to the throne, Lady Frances of Bridgewater, and Lady Elizabeth, Countess of Huntingdon. She died on the 23rd of January 1637 and was buried in St. Mary the Virgin Church of Harefield. A monument dedicated to the memory of Alice and her 3 daughters was built at St. Mary the Virgin to her own specifications before her death. As far as I'm aware, she had no further dealings with William Stanley or Elizabeth once the estate had been finalised. A few years after the death of his wife, when Derby was old and infirm and desirous of withdrawing himself from the hurry and fatigue of life, he assigned his estates to his son James, retaining an annuity of £1,000. There is some confusion in the literature, some reports saying that he lived out his life, died and was buried in Chester. Indeed, there is the Stanley Place on Watergate Street. These reports are almost certainly untrue and refers to another branch of the family. He was in fact buried in the family vault in the Church of St. Peter and Paul in Ormskirk, which is very close to Latham House, the likely place of his death. The church has a Derby chapel, beneath which the bodies of the Earls of Derby were laid to rest up until 1851. Now let's return to the painting of Elizabeth carried out around the time of her marriage in 1595. It took me quite a while to trace its whereabouts. Rather surprisingly, it hangs tucked under a stairwell in Blair Castle. Well, how on earth did it get there? Well, its journey began with William Stanley being appointed Lord of Man in 1609. The law of the time dictated that the island should be inherited by William's descendants. The painting, which dates from around 1595, was probably moved to the island when Elizabeth, his wife, took over the role in 1612. It remained on the Isle of Man until the 10th Earl of Derby, James Stanley, died in 1736 without any surviving issue. The barony of Strange and the lordship of Man passed to his first cousin once removed, James Murray, 2nd Earl of Athol, who lived from 1690 to 1764. At some stage thereafter it was moved to Blair Castle. The castle itself stands in Glengarry in Perthshire, Scotland, near the village of Athol, and is the ancestral home of Clan Murray. The current Duke, the 12th, now lives in South Africa. Sadly, Elizabeth does not get to enjoy the view of Glengarry. Here she is tucked away under the staircase, with the portrait of James Murray, the second Earl, towering above her. A rather sad ending to a beautiful and enterprising woman. I'm sure that she goes unnoticed by the vast majority of visitors to the castle. This, as far as I was aware, is the only known portrait of Elizabeth de Vere, but we may just have uncovered another one. This is an authenticated portrait of Lucy Russell, née Harrington, who lived from 1581 to 1627. It was painted around 1610 and hangs in Gripsholm Castle in Mariefred, Sweden. She was brought up at Combe Abbey in Coventry, just up the road from me, and became a very influential patron of the arts in the Elizabethan and Jacobean courts. She was closely related to Mary and Robert Sidney and was a friend of Penelope Rich. She was married to Edward Russell, 3rd Earl of Bedford, who became involved in the Essex Rebellion and was exiled from court and fined £20,000. Oddly enough, they lived in Bedford House, the mansion right next door to Cecil House. With the onset of the new monarchy, she enjoyed great success at court, becoming Lady of the Bedchamber to Anne of Denmark. She was a sponsor of Ben Jonson and regularly took part in and organised masques. She would have undoubtedly known Elizabeth, Countess of Derby, well. She is pictured wearing the regalia of a countess, with a coronet of a countess and ermine-trimmed garments. No doubt about her identity. The coat of arms she is waving at with her fan bears both elements of the Harrington family from her father and the Kellaway family, with 4 pairs, from her mother. This portrait of her is by an unknown artist from around 1620. It was recently bought by my old college, Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge. The pose and the crown at a jaunty angle are difficult to interpret. She's said to have a pensive expression, but to my eye it looks as though she fancies the artist. This is Montacute House in Somerset, a National Trust property which houses a number of portraits for the National Portrait Gallery. A fellow member of the De Vere Society, Joanne Venus, contacted me about a portrait hanging in the house. It's labelled possibly Lucy Russell, née Harrington, Countess of Bedford. And here she is, wearing the regalia of a countess and a French wheel farthingale dress, very typical of the late 16th and early 17th century. The reason for contact was that the face has more than a passing resemblance to that of Elizabeth de Vere. So let's take a closer look. Along the top are 3 paintings of Lucy Harrington. Below on the left is the Montacute House painting. They are certainly similar, with a prominent nose. Now let's add the face of Elizabeth de Vere. The human eye is usually very good at distinguishing facial features. To my eye, there is a striking similarity between the Montacute House painting and that of Elizabeth, more so than those of Lucy. As I've said many times before, facial recognition in old paintings is fraught with difficulties. However, it is possible to make a clearer comparison than just by looking at them. Here are 2 images that have been scaled and rotated using the centres of the eyes. In the Montacute painting, I've created a grid denoting facial features. This grid has then been superimposed upon the face of Elizabeth de Vere, shown on the right. If we follow down the horizontal lines, you can see that the hairline, the eyebrow line, the eye centres, the nose tip, the mouth level, and the chin are remarkably consistent. You may want to pause the video just to check that again. If we turn to the vertical lines, you can see that the image on the right is slightly rotated. as the line denoting the centre of the nose, E, is slightly to the right as you look at it. Rotation tends to shorten the face to the left, shown as A, and lengthen it to the right, F, which is what we can see. All other landmarks, such as the inner and outer corners of the eye, nose and mouth, are a very close fit. Once again, I've left you to pause the video if you wish. Here I've created a dot map on the Montacute image and superimposed it on Elizabeth de Vere. The central features of the face are a close match, and the slight rotational difference demonstrated by the outline of the face changing. Here I've applied the Montacute grid and dot map to Lucy Harrington. The head is rotated more to Lucy's right. The eyebrows are much more arched and prominent, and the chin is both longer and wider. The next thing is the hairline. In both the Montacute and Elizabeth de Vere portraits, there is a pointed appearance, usually referred to as a widow's peak, which is an inherited feature. Compare this with the two portraits of Lucy Harrington, where the hairline is quite straight. The difference is also visible on the dot map. Now let's look at the coronets. I'm not sure how many coronets a countess could have, but clearly the one worn in the Montacute subject is different from Lucy's. The setting of the stones within the frame is quite different, and the strawberry leaves in between the points on the Montacute painting are set with rubies, while those of Lucy Harrington are gold with pearl centres. Elizabeth wears a droplet pearl hanging from a rectangular stone set in gold. The Montacute portrait has a similar style, but it's not identical. This is not a jewel present in any of the portraits of Lucy that I've been able to locate. The last feature is the difference in dress style. If we lighten the image of Elizabeth, we can clearly see that she is wearing a French wheel farthingale dress, the painting dating from around 1595. The Montacute portrait, with a similar style, dates from around 1603. Lucy is not wearing this style in any of the portraits of her. There's another way of looking at this. In this short video, two facial images are superimposed and fade one into the other. In the first, concentrate very hard on the position of the eyes, nose and mouth. Here's the same thing again, but this time watch the outline of the lower face. I think you can see that the face is somewhat fuller in the Montacute image. So please feel free to make up your own mind. My personal view is that the Montacute portrait is of Elizabeth, Countess of Derby. Now let's take a closer look at the possibility of William Stanley writing under the name of William Shakespeare. This is quite a big topic, and I can present only a summary for you. I'm drawing heavily on the work of John Wrathall, published in 2009 in the Oxfordian Volume 9, and on his website. On John Rollett's book, William Stanley as Shakespeare, evidence of authorship by the 6th Earl of Derby as the man behind the mask, written in 2015, and an article by Amanda Hines and Alexander Waugh in the De Vere newsletter of July of 2019. If you want to go into greater detail, I suggest that you consult these works. Of course, all the evidence is circumstantial, as no works attributable to William Stanley survive under his own name, just around 50 letters in his own hand. The evidence in favour of William Stanley has been presented in a number of ways, and what follows is an interesting exercise in scrutinising that evidence. So here goes. First, evidence of playwriting. James Greenstreet first advanced the case for William Stanley in 1891. Greenstreet, a researcher and an authority on heraldry, published excerpts from 2 letters he'd come across in his research, both from George Fenner and dated June the 30th, 1599. In nearly identical language, they identify William Stanley as a writer of plays. Here are the direct quotations. 1599, June the 30th, London. George Fenner to his partner Balthazar Geibels in Antwerp. The Earl of Derby is busied only in penning comedies for the common players, and that's found in the State Papers. 1599, June the 30th, London. George Fenner to Sir Humfredo Galdelli or Giuseppe Tusinga in Venice. Our Earl of Derby is busy in penning comedies for the common players. Greenstreet expressed great surprise that such information was recorded prominently in the State Papers. He interprets the first letter to mean that the Earl of Derby was wholly absorbed in the composition of pieces for the stage. In fact, the strength of the wording in his letter is such that we might also imagine his lordship so bent upon this occupation as to neglect his meals and burn midnight oil in an endeavour to complete his comedies for some special occasion or by a certain date. Fenner has been described by Alexander Waugh as a shady and unreliable figure who went under a number of pseudonyms. And yet he is the only one who refers to William writing plays. There is no mention of the name Shakespeare and no source given for Fenner's information. Next is the evidence for play production. Derby's men, William's acting troupe, were active for more than 40 years, from 1594 to at least 1635. A particularly busy period was in London around 1600. In 1599, Robert Brown, the leader of Derby's men, held the lease and consequent control of the Boar's Head Playhouse in Whitechapel, built outside the city wall to avoid control of the Lord Mayor. This is a reconstruction of the layout, showing it to be a substantial structure. In 1599, Elizabeth wrote to her uncle, Robert Cecil, asking favour towards Lord Derby's men. Good uncle, being importuned by my lord to entreat your favour, that his man Brown, with his company, may not be barred their accustomed playing, in maintenance whereof they have consumed the better part of their substance. If so vain a matter shall not seem troublesome to you, I could desire that your furtherance might be a means to uphold them, for that my lord taking delight in them, it will keep him from more prodigal courses, and make your credit prevail with him in a greater matter for my good. So commending my best love to you, I take my leave. Your most loving niece, Elizabeth Derby. Sadly, the success was to be short-lived, as Brown died of the plague shortly afterwards. St. Paul's Cathedral had choir boys from the 12th century, and in the 16th century they were allowed to act in dramatic performances. During the second half of the century they performed at court more frequently than any other group. During the early 1590s they fell from favour until they were refinanced by the Earl of Derby around 1600, performing at court on the 1st of January 1601. There appear to be strong links in their performances with John Marston and John Donne, who accompanied William Stanley on his travels to France. Interesting though all this may be, although William Stanley was involved in the theatre at this time, it provides no evidence that he actually wrote any plays. Next, an acrostic. John Rolette draws great significance to an observation on the list of actors page in the first and second folios of Shakespeare's works. The argument goes like this. The only page in the book which the author could have a direct influence over in the printing process was this one, and therefore it would be a very good place to hide a message. For those of you not familiar with the term acrostic, it is in its simplest form a device used in verse in which the first letter of each line spells out a word or a name. Here is what John Follett noticed. This is the actor's page from the first folio. If you look at the word Kemp, it's spelt oddly, with a T at the end of it. From this we can construct a partial acrostic of Stanley. If one is being critical, the name after Kempt is missed out. The last two letters of Brian are used. A second name is omitted, and the ly of Sly are not at the end of the word, and Stanley ends in ley, not ly. It really all turns out on the altered spelling of Kemp to be deliberate, otherwise the argument is very weak. John Rollitt assures us that the probability of this arrangement of letters occurring by chance is several million to one. In addition, the same spelling occurs in the second folio, so it cannot be an error. Or can it? In 1600, Will Kemp Morris danced from London to Norwich over a period of 9 days. He then wrote his experiences in his book, Kemp's 9 Days' Wonder. You'll note that Kemp is written without an E, or indeed an apostrophe for that matter. Here is a woodcut from the same image, this time spelt with an E. The text refers to Kemp's 9 Days' Wonder, again with an E. The point being that his name was spelt both ways in the literature. If we return to the actor's page, you can see the difference in appearance if Kemp's name is spelt with an E on the end or a T. At some point the written name would have been transferred to type, and it seems to me most likely that this is when the error was made. Kemp had been dead for 20 years on publication, so it's easy to see how the misspelling went unnoticed. After all, it wasn't as though the first folio was free of typographical errors. Without the T, the argument that the name Stanley is hidden on the page, in my view, falls apart. The error was simply copied for the second folio. Now for Sith. Researchers such as John Hope, in his book The Authorship of Shakespeare's Plays, have used differences in word usage to try to identify collaborators in the works. John Rollitt adopted the technique to try to identify the author by comparing word usage in Shakespeare's works and those in letters written by one particular candidate, Edward de Vere. Indeed, John Rollitt gives his findings as the primary reason why he discarded him in favour of William Stanley. This type of study falls into the category of discrediting a rival in favour of your own candidate. The reasoning goes thus. The words sith, sithence and since, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, can mean either because or after that time. During the 16th century, the word since gradually became the predominant word to mean because. John Rollitt looked at the incidence of sith, sithence and since, meaning because, in Edward de Vere's poems and letters, and in Shakespeare's plays and poems, including the sonnets. The headline grabber is that Edward de Vere tends to use sith 50 times rather than since once in his letters and poems, while Shakespeare uses since 264 times rather than sith 23 times in his combined plays and poems. Hence they cannot be written by the same man. Now we can present the information more clearly by taking into account the word counts for each group. 3,000 for de Vere's poems, 30,000 for his letters, including the ones about tin mines, 900,000 for Shakespeare's plays, and 43,000 for his poems. There are 29 times more words in Shakespeare's plays and poems than in Edward de Vere's writings. If we assume for a moment that sith and since words are evenly spread across Shakespeare's works and poems, we can make a direct comparison of the incidence of sith and since per 33,000 words in Shakespeare's works by dividing the total by 29. In this direct comparison, Edward de Vere almost always uses sith and Shakespeare almost always uses since. However, the difference in the figures appears much less striking. Could there be other explanations for this discrepancy? Is it somehow linked to the declining use of sith in the 16th century? I suspect that it is. Much of Edward de Vere's poetry, of which there are only 16 authenticated poems, were written early in his life, while printed versions of Shakespeare's plays and poems came much later, and the spelling was not under his direct control at all. John Rollitt argued that there is no difference between the use of since between the quartos and the first folio, but any alteration may have occurred earlier in their careers, just as the word Kemp, when written word, was converted to type. One might have expected that Shakespeare's historical plays would have been written in an authentic language using sith, and yet this is not how they have been presented in type. Edward de Vere's letters have all come down in his own hand, and therefore provide a true record of his word usage in the very formal and traditional setting, as we've discovered by reading some of them. The difference in his use of sith versus since may then just be a stylistic one. Considering all this comes from a book advocating William Stanley as Shakespeare, yet there is no evidence that it furthers his case. He only wrote 50 letters which have survived, and so a similar comparison cannot be made. Although interesting observations, if set against the overwhelming evidence that Edward de Vere wrote as Shakespeare, I do not believe that they damage his case in any way. Moving away from evidence to discredit Edward, another approach has to demonstrate the similarities with William Stanley, presenting the latter as the man in the shadows ready to step into the light. Both were high-ranking courtiers to Elizabeth I. Both were highly educated and had links to the theatre from an early age. Both studied the law. Both travelled widely on the continent. Both had troupes of players which performed at court and in the public theatres. Both were close to Lord Burleigh and John Dee, the Queen's astronomer and physician, but still no evidence that William Stanley ever wrote anything. Contemporary references. Elizabethan literati had a habit of referring to others, and indeed themselves, with fanciful imaginary names, or those drawn from classical figures. This was partly to show how clever they were, and partly to avoid the wrath of their literary victims, or indeed the state. When two prominent individuals are either called Will or use it as a pen name, then it's easy to argue for one or the other as the target of the writers. If you have time to spare, then feel free to confuse yourself completely by trying to unravel contemporary references from the late 16th century. I think where William Stanley's case falls down badly is how he could have written Shakespeare's two great narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, both based on the work of Ovid, which is widely believed to have been translated by Edward de Vere while a teenager at Cecil House. The sonnets also provide a major stumbling block. John Follett was one of the first people to decode the dedication page of the sonnets to reveal Henry Rosalie as the fair youth. He then has to argue that William Stanley, for fear of inheriting the throne himself, which actually he wasn't, he wrote 17 sonnets urging Henry to get married and have children to ensure the Tudor line from his mother, Queen Elizabeth. A later and much more detailed analysis of the sonnet dedication page by Alexander Wall has clearly demonstrated multiple references to Edward de Vere, even where he was buried. Collaboration. I've hinted at an apparent close friendship of Edward de Vere and William Stanley. It seems that Elizabeth de Vere was very much involved in the promotion of her husband's theatre activity. There also appears to be good evidence that Edward de Vere liked his son-in-law and spent a number of occasions in his company during the final years of his life. Given their deep interest in plays, it would seem highly likely that they would have worked together in some way, whether in a new work, since lost, or in refining the Shakespeare canon, but it simply is not known. Right at the end of B.M. Ward's biography of Edward de Vere, when he considers collaboration with William Stanley, he simply says this: "The treatment of controversial matters that cannot be definitely settled by contemporary documents and evidence is outside the scope of this biography, and that probably is the best way to leave it." So there we have it, another tortuous journey through Tudor times, drawing together many elements which I thought might be of interest to you. Was Elizabeth de Vere the daughter of William Shakespeare, aka Edward de Vere? Of course she was. Unfortunately for her, she was a pawn in a game where it was convenient for her father to pursue his own interests rather than live as a family man, and for outside influences to try and destroy the relationship between Lord Burleigh and her father. Look no further than Robert Dudley and Lord Henry Howard. Was Elizabeth married to Shakespeare, aka William Stanley? Of course not. He was a man steeped in the theatre as a result of the interests both of his father and brother Ferdinando. But there is no firm evidence that he wrote plays or poetry. Only 50 letters written by him have survived. So once again, thank you very much for joining me. My next presentation will be about a very interesting French lady by the name of Diana. Look out for it.